Okay, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I welcome you all to another episode. We're adapting to the web, so it's another episode in Wednesday Night Live. And the word live has many meanings. I mean, the world of broadcasting and media, live means a live event as opposed to a recorded event. But there was once a time there was no technology, and the only thing you had was
Live.
right, either live or you're not. And there wasn't the concept of instant replays and rehashing the past. But if you ask the mystics and you study some of the spiritual books of Torah, the word live has also many other meanings. In his classic work, magnum opus, the Tanya, Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Tanya consists of 5 different sections. In the second section, he cites the words of the Arizal, the great mystic, whose Yortzeit was just yesterday, the 5th of Av, the Arizal's Yortzeit. Arizal is the great mystic who lived in Tzfat in the 16th century. So he cites the following concept, that everything in existence is alive. Even inanimate objects are pulsating with life and are constantly being actually renewed in what was called perpetual creation, a constant force of renewal. And though the naked eye doesn't see it, it's still happening. Now, of course, if you asked any scientists a few hundred years ago when the Arizal and other mystics were advocating and teaching these ideas, they would say it's fairy tales, myths, fantasies, because science at that time did not yet recognize or wasn't even aware of what we call the forces today, the 4 forces, the 4 systems. It definitely wasn't aware of what we call today quantum mechanics and subatomic particles, and the forces of DNA and the microscopic level that is invisible to the eye, but yet, as we understand today, shapes everything. So when you turn the clock forward, however, and we look back at these teachings and their relevance today, this is common knowledge. Even for people who claim they have no faith, it's common knowledge that the existence, the universe, is just a superficial level that we experience on our conscious level, and within it lie layers and layers and layers of life and life force. However, what science has not yet acknowledged, or perhaps when they never acknowledged, and the mystics always did, that it's not just about a empirical piece of knowledge to know that there are subatomic particles within everything that exists, because that's a nice statement, and it's true we can manipulate and turn it into all kinds of technologies, from cell phones to fax, to computers, to microchips, or to communications and all the advancements that we benefit from today. But the mystics take it a step further and say that you and I, personally, we can access that force of life. And that's where we're able to achieve and find hope, and we're able to find the ability to recover or renew our lives and rejuvenate our lives, because we're always in a constant process of being able to access those forces that are brewing and that are constantly being renewed beneath the surface. So it's interesting that in a world like ours, where there's so many advancements in technology at a breathtaking pace, where you practically every time you buy a new gadget, there's already another one that can replace it. Whereas if, most of you are too young to remember, but there was a time in the 70s, before the war, before several wars, where a new gadget was once in 5 years, once in 10 years. Televisions did not change, it was the same television and radio. There were no computers, telephones. It was the same thing. If you grew up as a child in the 60s or the 70s, probably the same telephones that your parents had, you had in your home. And really, very rare there was a change. If you read some of these more futuristic magazines, you thought of things coming. Now, yes, there was also the time of space travel, and that was a very big innovation then. But that too didn't happen overnight. That was over years of development, and so on. Today, it's a whole different world. So what's quite startling is that in direct proportion, disproportion, the paradox of all these advancements and so much movement on that level, when you talk to people on their psychological lives, there's deep despair, anguish, lethargy, paralysis. All the exact opposite of what technology is doing is constant movement, mobility. You can be everywhere, anywhere, in touch with everyone, whatever it is. When you talk about psychologically, and I speak from personal experience of meeting many, many people are very, very hopeless about their lives. There's a lot of misery. Some more acknowledged than others. Thoreau wrote this a long time ago, that most people live a life of quiet desperation. Today we also know it's not always so quiet. And there's, on the level of intimacy, personal relationships, finding love in your life, dysfunctional family structures, our relationships with our parents, with our children, is in a very, very lethargic state. And as I said, direct disproportion to that so-called flexibility and movement and life that you see in the world of technology, you see a direct opposite in people's personal lives. As they say, more things, as people will tell me so sadly and depressingly, the more things change, the more they stay the same. You know, the more I try to date and meet someone new, the more it just replays the same thing. So after a while, you don't want to replay an old record that just changes its characters and places. And I'm not suggesting that this is across the board for everyone all the time. Obviously, that would be a little ridiculous. But I would say there is definitely an undercurrent of certain despondency, a lack of spontaneity. Definitely, as we get older, the inability or unwillingness to have free abandon and try new adventures in the area I'm talking about of our psyches. And for the good reason. The reason is, when you're hurt long enough, in a sustained fashion, you retreat. What does a turtle do when it feels there's a threat? It draws back its head inside its hard shell. So we have all developed very extensive and complex and very sophisticated defense mechanisms. Some of them are so powerful that we ourselves don't even know how they undermine ourselves. And we have our strong defense mechanisms, including our minds and including other tools we use. And everyone can look into their own heart, as they say, as the good rabbis would say, Yoda inish benafshe. A person knows within their own heart and their own soul what kind of machinations and mechanisms we use to maneuver, to protect ourselves, to not be hurt, to manipulate, etc., etc. So I thought that, being that it's the 9 days, which is the saddest time of the year, saddest part of the calendar, but at the same time, that which doesn't kill us makes us stronger. The fact that Jews have gone through 9 days for so many thousands of years, close to 2,000 years, since the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, has only made us stronger, which means we've learned to we've learned to not just survive, but thrive through challenges. But above all, as you all know, the focus of this evening is always on the personal level, not just on the collective and historical level of Jewish survival, but on a personal level. The 9 days plays a very instrumental, say indispensable tool an indispensable tool how to deal with challenges. So though on one hand it's the saddest part of the calendar, you could say we'd all would like to do without it, and we always say that. There's a story with the Holy Originer, they call him, the Heilige Originer, Rabbi Originer, the great Hasidic Rebbe. And the story goes, it's a Tisha B'Av story. Tisha B'Av will be Sunday, the saddest day of the year. So there was a custom in some of the old little synagogues and shtibels in Russia that the kids or other adults who turned into kids, the inner child, would throw what they call beblach. They throw these, what do you call them? Little thorn beads. It was a symbol. Thorns are a symbol of pain, symbol of Tisha B'Av. They would throw them on people's spurs, right? These things. Burrs, they're called? All right, that's it. They're little thorn birds, yeah. You can find them, they can pick them off certain trees if you don't stick yourself too much. Obviously, you don't want to throw it into some dangerous place, but to get into like your teacher's beard was fun, and or a sweater or something like that. So in camp, we have these little traditions. I guess it's a way of it's like gallows humor, Tisha B'Av. It's a way of. And then they also had this way of so-called relieving some of the pain of Tisha B'Av. That anyone who came to the synagogue, they would lift them up to the synagogue had like a straw roof. They would lift them up through a hole through the roof. So the Rishner came in to the synagogue, and they didn't realize who he was. So they did the same shtick with him, the same little spiel, and they lifted him up. They realized who he was. Of course, they dropped him. I hope not in a way that hurt him, but and everyone was very embarrassed. The Heilige Originer, Tisha B'Av, not exactly how you behave. It's one thing you play around with each other. So the story goes, he turned to heaven and he said to God, he said, "Look at your people. They don't want this holiday. Why don't you take it away from them?" This Tisha B'Av, they were like so-called desecrating it. So he said, "So since they don't want it, why don't you take it away from them?" So this is definitely a period in time which we don't look forward to, but at the same time, as I said, everything is an opportunity. And the 9 days is a very powerful psychological tool that can help us look at ourselves in a new way. And often, the only time you can look at yourself in a new way is when things don't go so well. When you really know testing the mettle of a person is not when things are going well. It's when they're challenged. There's an expression, b'kisei, b'kasei, b'kaisei, that you can know the temperament of a person through their pocketbook, their anger, and their drink, how they drink. That's one thing. But there's also an expression which doesn't come from a Torah source. They attribute it, I'll tell you who after I say what it is, that they say about a woman, that a woman is like a tea bag. You don't know how strong she is until you put her into hot water. Now, the great luminary that said this was, they say, Eleanor Roosevelt. Okay. So, I didn't want to mention her name first because I didn't want to, if someone didn't like her or something, I didn't want it to taint the expression. Now, why women teabag? You could say a man as well. You put a man into hot water. I don't know. I guess women are more greater survivors and maybe need to survive more at the hands of men than the other way around. It's another discussion. But the point is that the 9 days is like hot water, and when you want to really see a person, you have to put them in a state of when they're challenged. And you see this throughout the Torah. This doesn't mean, God forbid, that we ask for or we expect or we want to be challenged. We actually say every day in the morning prayers, don't bring us to a test. Don't test our faith, don't test us. And we always bless each other that we should only have things b'teiv hanir v'aniglu, which means everything should be revealed good and shouldn't be challenged in any dark way. But after the fact, we are to look at it and just be bitter is also not the healthy approach. We have to redeem it. And how do you redeem challenges is by understanding that they do teach you about yourself in new ways. And you see this consistently. If every person in a relationship would understand that, relationships would thrive instead of being broken. because you see it as a challenge. Now, obviously, there are forms of betrayal and hurt that are not that easily forgiven, especially if there's no remorse. We have a door issue here. But at the same time, I can tell you that in many, many situations where there's a crisis in a relationship, and this can be between spouses, between parents and children, between friends, that in most situations, if it was used properly, it could be channeled into an opportunity to discover deeper strengths. And often we don't see it through, or the hurt is so powerful that you don't let any healing take place. And you see this as a central theme in the Torah as well, the concept, the idea of challenge and what it does to human beings. There is barely a story in the Torah that is smooth and simple. As a matter of fact, it's hard for me to even think of one that is smooth and simple that has a nice happy ending. They all are challenges. Go through this. I'm not going to go through every story right now, but the main ones. Adam and Eve in the garden, everything seems perfect, paradise, what's best? The serpent, they eat from the tree of knowledge, expelled from there. The people are thriving and living long and healthy and so on. They become self-destructive, you have a flood. Finally, an Abraham appears, and he goes through his challenges and wars and battles. And the same thing with Isaac, and Abraham has in his home, he has children, Yishmael and Isaac don't get along with each other. And Isaac has two children, Esau and Jacob don't get along with each other as well, even in their mother's womb. And then you could think, okay, Jacob's children now, fine, the tribes. They end up selling or trying to kill and then sell their brother into slavery. Another episode. Wherever you turn, there's not one story that does not have drama in it. And some people would say it's like it's I don't know, use the word soap opera, but it's everything is full of betrayal and incest, and brothers killing brothers, and jealousies and vengeance, and you name it. The Jews finally get out of Egypt, and you think that everything is going to be smooth sailing. No. Here they don't like the water, then they don't like the meat, and they don't like the water again, and they don't like the bread from heaven, and they want to go back to Egypt every few months. And 40 years in the wilderness, they finally go scout out the promised land. They come back, that's not good. Then you have the story of Korach. And the end of the Bible, you'd think, okay, after all this, at least there should be, the last verses should be some peace, should be a happy ending. What would be a happy ending? That Moses, you go to a movie, we all know that most movies, very few movies are popular if they have bad endings. So you could have, everything is terrible till the last minute. Here, the Bible ends, you'd think, okay, Moses is going into in the promised land at least. No. He dies in Jordan, an unknown place. The entire generation dies there, except for two people. And you have to just go to the book of Joshua, not even Chumash. No longer the Torah, the first 5 books of the Torah. You have to find out that the Jews actually entered the promised land. So if you stopped after the 5 books, you just know it was a sad ending. Moses, who prayed, was unable to enter the promised land. And I remember years ago, our good friend Philip was coming to this class, and it was the first time he ever read the Bible in its entirety. It was from beginning to end. And he came, sometimes someone who's never read it before has a fresh look at it, not used to it. And he came back to me and said, this is like a horrendous book. It's like, it's not, all the books he's read in Buddhism and Christianity, they all are very peaceful, blissful, make you feel good about love. You don't have this is like full of murder and betrayals and so on and so forth. And the Jews never learn; they're constantly complaining. And I remember when he pointed it out, it made me smile. At the same time, it was a very good question, and I had to think about it. And then I thought about it, and I realized that he's absolutely right. The Torah is called Torah's Chaim, a Torah of life. This is exactly the story of life. If the Torah was some type of blissful, peaceful piece of fiction, it wouldn't reflect our lives. This is exactly what our lives are like. Look at your life. Tell me if anything was smooth in your life. Smooth for a while. There's always going to be some surprise. This is a life that is filled with unknowns, unexpected twists and turns, losses, betrayals. Even you betraying yourself, forget about others. You could be inspired, hopeful, completely committed to something, and then some demon enters into you and it's all gone. It's a common thing. You don't want to call it a demon, don't call it a demon. Whatever it is. You can be inspired and yet not live up to it. Your mind can tell you one thing and your heart acts another way. We make constantly mistakes like this. We don't learn from our own mistakes. So the Torah is actually a very good reflective book because it at least it comes to tell you, join the club. We're all crazy a little, This is the story of history. It's always been this way. So that itself is somewhat a little relieving to know that everyone is this way. That doesn't solve the problem, but at least you don't think you're completely some anomaly. And yes, that we do have a conflict and a battle within us. And you start studying, you realize that there's two voices within each of us. There's an Esav and a Jacob. There's the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara. There's the voice of reason, and there's the voice of impulse. And they don't always get along. They do conflict. And there are battles that are constantly being fought within ourselves, with others, and with the larger universe. So, when we come to the 9 days, therefore, in a way it epitomizes, or in a sense concentrates, the so-called sadder dimensions of our lives. So it's not meant to be a period where we just sit and cry and remember a temple that was destroyed thousands of years ago. It's meant to help us relive, or in a way, I would say really actually revisit our own losses and pains. Because the destruction of the temple is really the destruction of our own inner temple. Our own loss of innocence. Anything that you would call destruction, whether it's of large magnitude or small. What is it? It could be a dream that was shattered, a love that was broken, any form of betrayal with yourself or with others. So if you think of the 9 days as that type of personal experience, you could see it actually as a catharsis, as a form of healing. Because that's what really the 9 days are about. We were not told to honor the 9 days just to remember the wounds of the past. They're meant to give us strength to deal with the wounds of the present and come through it stronger. So, in that context, I decided to call this class blind spots, or blind spots and bright spots. Because in subjective terminology, you hear often the expression, you can be your own worst enemy. Some go further and say your worst enemy is always yourself. So we're going to talk about blind spots a bit. Now first let's begin with this. Does anybody here feel they don't have any blind spots? If there's someone who doesn't have any blind spots, please raise your hand. And if it's in the web audience, just send us an email. In the subject line, just write no blind spots. Anybody? Okay. So of course there's the big dilemma. Someone there? Any volunteers? The big dilemma, or as you could say, the conundrum, the ultimate conundrum, is this. If we all have blind spots, how can we ever overcome them when we're blind to them? So you all know, anyone who drives a car knows that there's a blind spot when you look into your rear view mirror. Even though you have 2 or 3 rear view mirrors, there's still one blind spot. Like over your right shoulder, you're changing a lane, a certain point, there's a point that you have to look back. I mean, some of us guess, or some of us, based on the mirror, based on what we picked up, other cars moving and speed and so on, you can assume. But we all know there is one place where there's a blind spot, and often accidents happen. So the only way is really to turn around and look over your shoulder and look at that section where you're about to turn and to change lanes. You know what I'm referring to, that blind spot? Yeah. And maybe that's a way God built into the auto industry, a reminder that no matter all the technologies, they can't resolve that blind spot. With all the mirrors. Once you have like 50 mirrors, even trucks and so on. It's interesting. It's just a lesson. So when it comes to automobiles, obviously a car accident, God forbid, is not a pleasant thing and could be dangerous and so on. But in psychological terminology, what are we to do about our blind spots? Which means you don't even know you have them. Not like I often mention, I can never forget, it just remains with me forever, with that guy that told me, I said, do you have any blind spots? He says, yes I do, but I know what they are. So it's almost like the doctor that says, I'll tell you when you need a second opinion. Same idea, you know. So what are we to do about that? Or in broader terms, subjectivity. So it's one thing to make mistakes in your life, and it's and we'll all make our mistakes. But when it comes down to it, we are Adam Karev Eitzel Atzmei is the expression in the Talmud. A person is subjective about themselves. And the literal meaning is Karev is close to himself, meaning you self-love biases and blinds us. And being that as such, how is it ever possible for us not to be our own worst enemy if you can't see it? So there's the Torah says the expression in the chapters we'll be reading soon. Hasheichid ya'aver einei chachamim u'masalef divrei tzadikim. That sheichad, which is literally a bribe, but it doesn't necessarily mean money, financial, any bias, any sheichad, any form of bias, blinds the eyes of the wise and distorts the tongue, the lips, the speech, the words of a tzaddik, of tzaddikim. Now in the Torah, which we call Torah Semes, a Torah of truth, uses a word called chachamim or tzaddikim. It's not a euphemism, it's not an exaggeration. The Torah is not being cynical or tongue-in-cheek and saying, this is a so-called tzaddik, this is a so-called chacham. This is a true tzaddikim and true chachamim. So if sheikhet, if bias can blind the eyes of the wise and distort the tongue, speech, the words of tzaddikim, how could you call them chacham and tzaddikim? They're not so wise and they're not so tzaddikim if they can be biased. And the answer, of course, is that nobody is immune from Adam Karev Eitzel Atzmei. Nobody is immune from being subjective. That even Moshe Rabbeinu himself, the humblest man that ever walked on earth, a man of God, who saw God face to face like no one did, and paid the price. It's very clear his humility was not just a concept, it was in actions all the time. Even he had to recuse himself, or chose to recuse himself when it came to saying an opinion about his brother or sister. Because he knew that ultimately, even if you don't think you're subjective, if this is your brother and sister, flesh and blood, by nature there's something that's going to cause some bias. Even if you're aware of it. Because that's what a blind spot is. That you may be aware that you have, but you may not know where it may taint your viewpoint. As a matter of fact, the wiser you are, and the bigger the tzaddik, the more the bias can have impact. Because if you're a fool, so your excuses and your ability to distort is also going to be quite mediocre. The smartest people are the ones with the best excuses. If you ever meet a truly manipulative person who really knows the art of manipulation, you never can track. A person that's smart knows how to cover his tracks and has 50 other scapegoats that will always be blamed. Because when you're smart, you also have, as I said, smart excuses. So when you talk about being your own worst enemy, who's the worst of all? The person who's the strongest. So in Tanya, he puts it this way. He says that the mind, in chapter 9, he says, the reflective mind is where the divine soul rests. The animal soul, he says, rests in the subjective heart. And the conflict, when we say the conflict between mind and heart, between your emotions and between your mind, is essentially a conflict between a reflective aspect of yourself and a subjective one. To put it in very simple terms, you have subjective interests. You see something that tempts you. Or somebody tries to manipulate your emotions. You know, a telemarketer calls you and they really know how to sell you something. And you say, listen, I want to reflect on it. No, this opportunity will be gone in a minute. If you don't do it now, it's over with. So they feed into your so-called panicking that you're going to miss out on a great opportunity. So who has not had the challenge? You just can't say no for some crazy reason. So we say call back, these type of things. Why don't you just say no? What's happening here? That your mind is telling you should think about it, reflect on it. Your heart is telling you just act, either because you've been manipulated, or because you're emotional about it, or because you have self-interest. And there's a battle that goes on. So in Tanya, in a brilliant way, he explains that just like the blood of the heart rushes to the brain, meaning the brain also needs blood for sustenance, for thinking, so the emotions of the heart also rush to the brain, that the real distortion that takes place in this battle is not that your heart should be subjective. If human beings weren't subjective, they wouldn't be human beings. When we say Adam Karav Eitz Latzman, that a person is subjective, that's not a statement that's some type of negative statement. It's just a reality. If we were not subjective, we would not have self-interest. We would not be protecting ourselves and our young. So there's a lot of elements of subjectivity that are very positive, that motivate you, that drive you. If it's harnessed properly, it can be a force of unbelievable good. The problem is that when this blood or the emotions of the heart race into the mind, what it does, it affects the mind. It distorts it. As it says, it blinds the eyes of the wise and distorts the words of the tzaddik, that the mind now begins to think differently, to the point that you can't even know, this reflective mind is suddenly no longer objective. That's a much worse problem, that the heart has affected the mind to no longer be objective. And that's why the Torah makes such a statement. If the Torah said that this is only the subjectivity that we all have, the Torah is warning that don't think because you're a tzaddik or a chacham, because you're a pure person and you never made a mistake before and you don't have temptations, or you're a wise person that has always been wise, that the bias of your own subjectivity will not affect you. It affects you much worse than it will affect anyone else. Because as I said, someone that has these strengths, the distortion also becomes much deeper. So after all this is said and done, the question then is, so how do we get beyond these blind spots? If we are truly blinded to them. So the obvious answer, the most basic answer would be, that's why you have in the Torah the concept of what we call asay l'charav. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says that you should appoint for yourself, designate for yourself a Rav, a teacher, a mentor. The word Rav has many meanings, but someone that you subject yourself to, some authority that you listen to. The next part of that statement is Knei lecha chaver. You should acquire for yourself a chaver, a friend. So both of these individuals, whether it's an authority figure, which is like more of a Rav, or a friend that's more of like a colleague, are powerful forces to counter our own subjectivity. What we call today consulting with someone. Shua b'reiv yayitz. That Shua, salvation, comes when you consult with many. When something is very important to you, you consult, because you may have it all figured out, but you still may be too close to it, you may still miss something. We consult. People do this all the time. Build businesses, you build companies. It's critical to have objective perspectives. Number one is you may not be an expert in every area. Number two, you're subjective. So other people will point out different elements. And in general, it doesn't hurt to have as many opinions as possible, because you can then weigh all the options and come out with the most crystallized, clear picture. The truth is, this is actually the whole process of Babylonian Talmud Bavli. So it says, when there's a disagreement between the Babylonian Talmud and the Yerushalmi Talmud, these were two academies. One was based in Babylon. After the first temple was destroyed, and later the second temple, the Babylon, became a center of Torah study. And there was also a Jerusalem Academy. In many ways, the Jerusalem Academy actually was superior to the Babylonian, whether it's because Ein Torah Keteris Eretz Yisrael, because Torah study in Israel has a more refined element to it. The Avir, the earth, the air of Israel itself is makes one wiser. Of course, the cynics always ask the question: if you're not wise in the first place, will it help if you go to Israel? That's another discussion as well. But and you see that in the Talmud there's a story with Rabbi Zera. He wanted to forget the Babylonian Talmud in order to acquire Jerusalem Talmud, so he fasted. So in many ways you see the Jerusalem Talmud has so-called superiority, yet over the Babylonian Talmud. Yet you find at the same time that when there's a disagreement, and there are disagreements between what something says in Talmud Bavli and something in Talmud Yerushalmi, so the halachic in Talmud Bavli, the ruling will go according to the Babylonian Talmud. So the technical reason is because the Babylonian Talmud was sealed 100 years after the Jerusalem Talmud. So being that they were so-called Basrei, they were the last, so they already could weigh all the arguments of the Jerusalem and the new arguments and discussions that followed. So you always defer to the so-called last scholar who has all the information available. But nevertheless, it's still lacking explanation. So in the Arizal and Hasidic texts explain that the difference between the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud is the difference between what they call Eir Yasher and Eir Chezer, which relates to the 9 days, as you'll see in a moment. And that is, Eir Yasher means in Hebrew, literally means a direct light. Eir Chezer means a refractive light. The difference would be, for instance, the sun and the moon. The sun is a luminary that generates its own light and heat. It has the nuclear forces within it that has a power to give off light. The moon has no light of its own. In the words of the Zohar, Les la megar ma klum, it has nothing of its own. It reflects like a mirror the light of the sun. But it gives off its own form of light. Moonlight, though it's only what the sun delivers to it, has its own personality. It doesn't even look like the sun. It has a much more silvery glow, much more haunting look. And this isn't just a look, it also has different effects on earth. The moonlight, for instance, there are plants that grow to moonlight, not to sunlight. It doesn't seem logical. If the moon is just diminished sunlight, just like a mirror of the sun, then why would there be plants that only grow in the moon and not in the sun? I mean, there are many explanations for it, but just to show you that once it becomes refractive, so-called reflected of the moon, it takes on a new personality. And as well, even in literature, you find the moon has a different so-called poetic perspective. You'll hear about people who love each other staring at the moon, but you never hear about them staring at the sun. So it has this romantic element. And of course, finally, the moon also has the aspect of affecting the tides. The cycles of the moon affect the tides on Earth. So you see that the moon has its own impact on Earth that is quite unique and different than the sun. So this is a classic example in using Kabbalistic terminology of Eir Yasher and Eir Chezer. That we too, within our own personalities and our lives, we have both elements, called a mashpia and a makabel. There are times that we generate and we transmit, and then there is our ability to receive, to absorb. Now here's an unbelievable concept. You think that the ability to absorb or to receive is a one-way street. To transmit means you're giving and one is receiving. So it says, Yeshir Mamasha Ha'asher Esim Ha'ani Ha'ani Esim Ha'asher, which means more than the transmitter is doing for the recipient gives back to the transmission. The Talmud says that a great sage said, where did you learn what you know? He says, I learned much from my teachers. I learned even more from my colleagues, Chaverim. And above all, Mitamidei Yesim Kulam. I learned most from my students. Now, students definitely are inferior intelligence to this teacher. To learn from your teachers would seem the one that you learn most from. colleagues next, and the students least. So what is it that he learned from his students that he didn't learn from the teachers or from his friends? Is the power of chazer. That when you have to convey something to a level that's not your own, you have to reach much deeper inside yourself and come out with a much more powerful, crystallized understanding of the concept. Think of the last time you had to, maybe no one likes to do this, but you have ideas in your mind, the machshava. If you have to formulate these ideas and speak and give a class or share it with others, you have to exert yourself a lot more than your own thought. But thought is much more powerful than speech. There are things in our mind that we can never convey in our liba lepuma legalia. There are things in our heart that we can never reveal in our words. And you say it goes a step further. If you have to write it down, it's even more difficult than speaking it. Now, words on paper are never as powerful as words in speech, because it's somewhat detached from the writer. And words in speech are never as powerful as the ideas in your mind. Yet, when do you really fully understand something? Only when you're able to write it. And that's why it's so difficult. It's not difficult because putting words on paper is hard. It's because to get ideas and be able to communicate in a way that others can understand it, even when you're not sitting with them, requires you going much deeper into your own machshava, in your own thought process, and coming out with a much more profound way of understanding the concept. We say every Friday night, Seif Maisa b'machshava tchila, that the final act, the end of the action, Seif Maisa, the end of the product, the end product, originates where? B'machshava tchila. And some interpret that in the beginning of your thought process. When do you see the true test of a concept? Is when it's able to be presented in its final, it's having the end in mind, as they say. So this is long before Stephen Covey's 7 habits. The end in mind forces you to have to dig much deeper inside. And this is the power that the moon has that the sun does not have. I'll just use myself as an example, if I may. Call it a kosher guinea pig example. I had the distinct honor for many years to absorb and memorize the words of the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, which is really in essence the process of Tisha B'Av. When we say the oral Torah, I was talking about the Babylonian Talmud. So the oral Torah was actually for close to 1,000 years when Moses would teach. And when Moses was up on the mountain, did he take notes as God taught him the Torah? No, he listened to it and he absorbed it. And then God actually made hafsekim, spaces, which are the spaces we have in the Sefer Torah scroll, so that he could reflect on what he had just heard. And then the teaching would go on. So Moses, most of what he heard was actually memorized by him. And most of what Moses taught was memorized by his students. In the whole process that the Talmud, Rashi cites, of exactly how he taught first Aaron and then the Zkenim, and the whole process, and Aaron's children and the Zkenim and the scholars. All of this was memorized. The Rambam, Maimonides, does write that the Jews made notes for themselves on shards just to keep, but most of it had to be memorized. There are reasons for that. I don't want to go into it right now. Torah Shebiksav, actually, when we say the or written Torah, is really only a tip of the iceberg of what they were learning during those years. It was almost like the short notes that you would write that include so much more. But every verse in the Torah, every verse in the Torah came with layers and layers of interpretations that were all memorized. It was only almost 1,000 years later when Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda Anossi, and his colleagues realized, which meant the time came that we have to write this down, because it was being forgotten, and much was forgotten. Obviously, they were anticipating the destruction of the temple, and ultimately they were anticipating, which means that the Jews would no longer be centralized with a Sanhedrin, with a Supreme Court in Jerusalem. They would be dispersed all over the world. So all that was preempted in a way that now we're writing down that which we had received for years orally. But since I had the privilege of, for many years, doing this, I realized the power of it. And let me share it with you, and you'll see what chazer is, refractive light, and how it affects us all. Remember, we're on the subject of blind spots, so it's all connected. You'll see in a moment, so bear with me. So because Shabbos no tape recorders were used, and notes weren't taken, so when the Rebbe would speak, as I said, it wasn't those good old days before there was technology in the first place, you had to listen and remember. Only use your own natural mind. Now, this is not no small feat, to remember hours and hours of talks, especially if they're very dense and complicated, and you had no idea where it was going. The Rebbe did not give anybody a synopsis of what he was going to say. It's not like a speech from a president or someone else that you get the whole speech printed out beforehand. Why he has to deliver it, I always wondered. If you're ready, just front publish it. I guess for people who can't read. So here we were listening, and we had to absorb and remember. And it's a long discussion itself. What are the exact secrets? I always think of writing a book called the Memory Tips. But the truth is, there's no question there's a certain gift, a certain natural gift, but there is an art to it, the art of listening. And at the time, I really didn't fully appreciate it. Today, in retrospect, I appreciate it because I don't really do it anymore. I've known that it's important enough to me to remember what they have to say. So there are two key things that I always share with people when they say, what is the secret to it? Two main things. One thing is when you look around, who as a segment of the population remembers things best? Any guesses? Children. If there were children in this room, maybe they would have answered that. But children. We adults, you barely remember what you heard a few minutes ago or yesterday. We'll have all kinds of gadgets and gimmicks trying to... Children, and we were all children once, never forget certain things, even stupid things. Songs you heard, stories you heard, events that to everyone else may have been insignificant, but to you was a major thing your father or mother may have done, is etched in your memory forever and ever. So why is it that children who have less developed minds than adults, you'd think, remember less? Because memory is a faculty of the intellect. The answer is one simple answer. Children don't think with their egos. When we adults listen to someone speak, and here's a good example right now, when we listen to someone speak, the first thing we think is, I like what this person is saying, I don't like it. I can make money with this, I can't make money with this. We immediately are processing the information. So you think, okay, what's wrong with that? There's nothing per se wrong with it, but I'll tell you right now, what's wrong with it is you're not listening any longer. You are processing information before you've heard it all. Listening means, and I would say there's like two wheels in the brain. One wheel absorbs information, and another wheel processes information. Children don't have yet a developed processor, so to speak, because they don't have a context yet. They've not grown up yet. Adults do. So that's why when we listen to someone, we're already listening, not complete 100% absorption, so you're not going to retain it. You're listening and also processing, so you're already a partner, and it's not a pure transmission from the teacher to the listener, the speaker to the listener. The listener is also a part of it because he's processing and has ideas and so on. I remember many times when the Rebbe would say something, or anyone says something very intelligent. So what does it do? Immediately sparks in your mind. Your wheels start turning. Oh, it reminds me of something I read. Now it makes sense. Something else I had a contradiction. You think, okay, that's great. That's not good. Why is that not good? Because you are now offering your thoughts, and you're not listening anymore to what the teacher is saying. So for us, the most difficult part was to shut off that processor and just listen. Very, very difficult thing to do, especially if you're an intelligent person. Okay. Children don't have this problem, so it may be hard to get a child's attention, but once you do, a child absorbs like a dry sponge, because the child has no context, has no ego, has no self-interest involved here. So child, 2 plus 2 is 4? Okay, 2 plus 2 is 4. Try teaching an adult the mathematical table. Try learn a new language as an adult. A child doesn't have context. So a child is a complete absorber. Either the Torah lemivla le polit is an expression in Aramaic, in the Talmud. It says that when you're busy absorbing, you can't be transmitting, and also vice versa. And that's what we had to do. Very, very difficult thing to do. But we all do it, by the way. I'll show you where. If you have to research a project where you have no self-interest in, you're going to first research all the information before you come to conclusions, hopefully. So you can start with Googling, or whatever it is that we do today. That makes us super wise. And you're going to look through all the information. And even if you don't always do it, you may be lazy, but we all understand the value of doing that before you come to conclusions. How would you like a judge sitting in a case on you and coming to a conclusion when he looks at your nose before he hears all the testimony? So truly listening means that you cannot process while you're absorbing. That's what it really means. Now, in relationships, you see this all the time. Usually women accuse men of this more than the other way around. At least that's the way I find. So may we rally all the men here together and say, what happens? Here's a conversation. So the woman says to her husband, "You're not listening to me, my dear." And he says, "I heard every word you said," and repeats it like a tape recorder. She says, "Yeah, I know you heard it, but you didn't listen." What's the difference between hearing and listening? Hearing, if you have healthy... Why are you laughing, James?
Never heard that before. Never said anything like it.
Okay, we have here specimens. Hey, so Jan and James. Okay, if you don't mind, take a bow. Welcome to the club. So listening, hearing. If you have healthy ears, you hear. A tape recorder also hears things. Listening means something else completely. And how often does this happen? As I said, usually women accuse men of this more than the other way around. That in the middle of the conversation, before you even finish your sentence or saying something, the guy's already giving you an opinion or a response. He may not even heard what you said. You're giving a response to what you think, and then the best of all is when someone tells you, well, you say, well, you're not responding to what I said. Well, you know why? Because what you said should have been said something else. They're telling you that you should say something else. So then, to fit your initial statement that you initiated to their response, when it should be the other way around. The response should be like a response to your statement. You ever hear anybody tell you that? I've had this. Someone says to me, "Well, then you should have said it differently. Then my response would have been appropriate, so to speak." They're telling you. So I say, "Yeah, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying what I want to say, not what you want me to say." Okay. So basically, a conversation really means that you listen to someone. Essentially, really listening means that you respect the sacred space of another person, whether you like what they're saying or you don't like it, and you truly listen from beginning to end, and you selflessly step away while they're speaking, and then you think into it. That would be called true listening. This art of listening is very, very rare commodity today. So I really feel very blessed that I did this for many years. It changed my whole life. There's no question about it. And I really see the difference between listening and not. And I see it in myself too. It's not like I always listen either. Trust me. So sometimes people come to me and they tell me, one second. And the second element that I wanted to say was that what you're listening to has to have real value. See, when the Rebbe would speak, for us it was like Moses coming down from Mount Sinai sharing wisdom that you'll never hear again. So if someone told you that you will have, in an hour from now, a lecture will be delivered that will change your life forever. Address issues you've been grappling with from the beginning of time. And you really believe that. Trust me, your adrenaline would be flowing and you'd remember a lot better than you remember. So nowadays, often people ask me, they speak to me and I'm daydreaming or whatever it is, and they say, "Well, did you hear what I said?" So I've said, "Well, can you repeat it or can you rephrase it?" Is the way we say it, when you didn't hear it in the first place. So they say, "Well, you heard 7 hours of the Rebbe's talk, so you can remember. You can't remember 3 minutes of mine." So I don't want to be the one that breaks it on them, that I don't see history unfolding in their words. But that's what happens when you don't see value in the words. Obviously, your ego gets in the way, and you also process, and you would not necessarily listen properly. I'm not defending myself. I'm just saying that we all can be prone to this. But as I said, thank God, I've also seen the other side. I have seen the ability to listen, and I frankly, if I had any influence on the education system, because this isn't just about study, it's about personality. People really don't know how to listen, I must tell you. I know many of you think you may be great listeners. Remember, don't confuse listening to being passive and just letting others do the talking. That doesn't mean you're a good listener. It just means that you rebel in silence, basically. And some people do it with words. Listening is a real art, and it takes a lot of work, a lot of discipline, especially as an adult. And this brings me back all the way to the blind spot issue. You want to learn how to get beyond blind spots, you have to learn to listen. And the hardest thing to listen is the things you don't want to hear, obviously. Things you want to hear are of course easy. You want to be you're confirming your theories. So I was speaking about Talmud Bavli and Or Chayzer. I was saying before that the process, why ultimately the halacha, the law, is according to the Babylonian Talmud, because in the Babylonian Talmud, because it was Babylon, not Jerusalem, they had to struggle with every idea. The Machshakim Hashivani, the Talmud says, that in darkness we sat, or we were placed, Hashivani, you placed us, goes on Talmud Bavli. Because Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, does not begin with a crystal clear idea. It begins with confusion, with arguments. The Talmud Bavli is filled with arguments. Arguments with good intentions, but all trying to understand a concept. It says, had the luches, had the tablets not been shattered, there wouldn't have been all this pilpul of Talmud Bavli. We would have a clarity that you just see clearly the picture without having to struggle. Today, that's not the case. Today, we have to go through the Ur Chayzer approach. We cannot just see things clearly. You have to go through debates and discussions and arguments and counter-arguments and consulting with others. So Talmud Bavli is the epitome of this type of discussion. But then at the end of the process, you come away with a crystal clear picture, much clearer than if you just get it straight out. Think of it like two minds. There are people who are blessed with very quick minds. They pick up ideas quickly. Smart, good brain power. Then there are people who really, what they call harvit, they actually exerted themselves, strained themselves, and broke their minds through. And I remember in yeshiva, and I'm sure everyone in school, you probably had friends like this. There were guys that had just very smart brains, very fast brains. They picked things up quickly, but they were also lazy. Because they got things so quickly, they didn't have to work at it. And there are others that really had to break their teeth, hours and hours. And I look back and I see some people who broke their teeth, and I look at them today, much more profound and developed minds than the ones that had initially very, very sharp brains. The ones with the sharp brains, that's called Er Yasher. You got the light straight. It's like someone who has that type of clarity that's able to see. But there's a certain refinement and there's a certain clarity that comes only when you've been in darkness. Only when you had to really work at it from the bottom up. You know, obviously we'd love to have the best of both worlds. But that's when we say Yagaiti Matsasi. There's something that comes through strain, and through strenuous process, that helps you get to that type of clarity. So the moon, as opposed to the sun, has a power that the sun does not have. Which is why the Jewish people are compared to the moon. And we count Daimim and Moinin, we count to the moon. The lunar cycle determines the holidays. Yes, we reconcile it in a leap year like this year with the sun, but it's still fundamentally a lunar cycle. It's a lunar month. The 9 days are the 9 days in the month of Av, and a new moon is a new month. Rosh Hashanah begins in the new month, the new moon. The major holidays are in the 15th of full moon, Sukkot, Pesach, Purim, and so on. So the lunar cycle controls. Why the lunar? The sun seems so much more powerful. Because the power of the moon is the power of absorption. So when you say absorbing the divine is much more powerful than transmitting the divine. Because absorption requires real work. And when you work on it, it becomes yours, you own it. Whereas when you receive it as a gift, you never really own it. It was a gift. That's the difficult effort. When you learn how to listen, you learn to absorb. And when you learn to absorb, you begin to own the idea. So there's the concept of, you say Torah's Moshe. Why is the Torah called the Torah's Moshe, the Torah of Moses? It's the Torah of God. We never attribute the Torah of God to a human being. So it says, Kivin Shemosri Nafshe Aleh, because Moses gave his life for it. What does that mean? It means he so worked hard at absorbing the Torah that he became like one with it. So it's not the Torah that Moses' Torah, God forbid, it's God's Torah. But Moses became a transparent channel of God's wisdom. That only comes through real difficult exertion. And you see this consistently. You see the arguments that say Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael in the Talmud. Rabbi Yishmael was a high priest. Rabbi Akiva was either a convert or a son of converts. Who ultimately becomes the person that you say the whole Talmud, Kula Libed Rabbi Akiva. Because he, as I discussed last week, at age 40, first began his journey. So he came from darkness. And that's why he's ultimately the one that has the most crystal picture of the deepest wisdom. And you see this, I see this very often with people who've gone through very difficult lives. Many are broken, but the refinement of a person who went through the fire, there's no refinement like that. The refinement of a human being who suffered is of a different quality you'll never find by someone who has not. Again, this is not a justification, nor is it something that we should be looking forward to. But after the fact, you can't deny its power. The Kur HaBarzel, the so-called furnace that hardens someone, is an unbelievable power. So we go back now to the blind spot issue. The question, how do you get beyond blind spots? So I was talking about teachers, a friend. Yeah, that's the obvious answer, is to be able to have someone you can consult. And as I said, when it comes to business or other areas that are important to us, we do a lot of consulting. And consultants take a lot of money too. And we review it, and we go to lawyers, and we try to find objective parties because we're not objective. Yes, it's true that many accountants will tell you that the biggest enemies to every business is their own owner, who doesn't want to hear, he or she doesn't want to hear about the mistakes they made. And if some accountants, their job is simply to be therapists and try to explain that that you shouldn't repeat the mistakes, but some people just don't want to hear. You don't want to hear what a mistake you made. But if you're a healthy person, you go to consultants. The problem is, the hardest place to go to someone to speak to is not about your business. That's relatively easy because business is about making money. And if you go to someone that's objective, you're going to have a better perspective than if you just rely on your own instinct. That doesn't mean instinct doesn't matter. You combine instinct plus objective advice. But when it comes to our personal lives, that's where it really gets difficult. Because the first thing we say to ourselves, nobody can understand me. I'm too complex. I'm too profound. Or too much darkness. Nobody can ever understand such darkness. Which of course feeds into what we call existential loneliness, that we essentially all feel ourselves very lonely in a way. As I discussed last week, Yirmiyahu says in Echa, which we'd like to not read, but we may read this Saturday night, Lamentations, he starts, Echa Yoshva Badad. Woe that she sits alone. Badad is alone. Of all the things, what troubled Yirmiyahu most was not the destruction itself, not the Holy of Holies being desecrated, not the deaths, not the exile, the loneliness. Because the loneliness is the thing that is the killer. That you don't feel there's anyone with you. You don't know if God is with you. Start questioning if there's anyone that can relate to you in that lonely place. And then, of course, there's this fear of being exposed. People don't want to open themselves up to others. They don't know if they can trust. We've also learned that sometimes people you trust abuse that trust, unfortunately. So it doesn't make it very conducive to want to be open again. On the other hand, we do have blind spots, and sometimes the things that we're looking for, we are our own worst enemy, because we can't get beyond the blind spot. So that's why the Aseh L'cha Rav concept and Knei L'cha Chaver, and they both play off each other, I'll explain in a few minutes, is an unbelievable concept, but it requires something before that. It requires the humility and the courage to reach, to go pay lip service and so-called to do it by rote, to appoint yourself a Rav and say, okay, I have someone I consult with, is meaningless. It depends whether you really listen to the person. So listening, as I said, is a big art. It's like having to turn ourselves into a moon instead of into a sun. And that's not an easy thing to do in this world that we've been trained to, that if you want to get something, you have to be aggressive and go get it. The requirement to get beyond the blind spot requires the concept of bittul, which is the essence of the moon. The ability to withdraw, the ability to step back, the ability to really listen. And it's in direct proportion to your ability to listen is you're going to be your ability to see beyond the blind spot. And therefore your ability to get somewhere where you've never reached before. Simple as that. So I don't think there's anyone in this room that will say, I'm completely satisfied where I am. I mean, sameach bechelka is a great virtue, to be satisfied and not complain. But we all have dreams. We all have aspirations. And we should. The Torah and God wants us to use our years and our health and our skills and our tools and our faculties to grow constantly. To grow from one strength to strength. And they say, if good is best and is better. If something is good, so if good is better, not better. Again, that doesn't mean complaining all the time, but it means that a healthy human being is always aspiring to something. A human being should always have some healthy angst, something you've not achieved, that you're looking for. If angst gets overwhelming, then it can turn into something that's to anxiety. So we always need a measure of both. It's like climbing a ladder. You have to always know there's a step above you that you're reaching towards, but you also have the step that you're at, and you do it step by step by step. So that type of commitment of the angst, the natural angst that a person has to reaching out, if you want to move from where you are right now, there's only one possibility. You have to know how to listen. You can be motivated all day from day to tomorrow. Someone just told me he works in the diet industry, makes kosher diet meals or something like that. You know, they deliver you fresh foods. I wrecked one of these things. So I asked him, when is the hottest season? He says, now is not such a great season. The hottest season is right after New Year's. So I asked him, how long does it last? She says, actually it lasts because they paid already, so it lasts till they finish paying. But it's the New Year resolutions, of course, of losing weight. That's the thing. So these resolutions last how long? Sometimes in Yiddish they used to say an expression that lasts from Esther Tanis bis Purim. You know, it lasts from the fast of Esther to Purim. You know how long that is? Basically a night. Yeah, a day at best. So why do all our inspirations and our resolutions, we all talk about New Year resolutions and other resolutions, how come they don't last long? So, you know, it sounds like a stupid question, but it's not. It's the analysis of a human being. And I'm talking about someone who truly resolved. We're not talking about someone who's faking it or did it because others did it. You truly resolve to do certain things that you know are right. It could be life and death matters, sometimes very vital things, and you just go back to your own, gravitate back. So the obvious answer we'll give is that patterns are patterns, and it's not that simple to get out of a pattern. You want to, but it's not that easy. You're already in a rut, so to speak. The second thing is, I mentioned this evening, is of course our own subjectivity, self-interest, and you forget. You get like a blind spot, exactly. Like the Talmud says, Ein adam ever avera, eli im kein nichnas by ruach shtus. A person doesn't do an avera, sin, unless they have a moment of insanity, shtus, of sanity, foolishness, stupidity, whatever you call it. Now, why is that the case? As I remember someone asking me, "What's wrong? Everyone has a yetzer hara. I do a sin because I have a yetzer hara, because I have temptations, not because I'm being insane." It's actually quite natural. Like that rabbi, that someone came to the rabbi and said, "What do you say? The expression?" He said, "My son went crazy. He's dancing with shiksas and he's eating chazer," which means he's dancing with shiksas, non-Jewish females. Yes, and he's eating pork. So the rabbi answered, "That's natural. If he was dancing with pork and cannibalizing, then that would be a problem." You know. So, but the Talmud still says it's a ruach shtus. So one of the answers given for this is based on an interesting law. You know, in the Torah, in the Talmud, there's laws of what's called the shmirah. If you're appointed the guardian, different levels, Someone hires you to protect their property. So there's 4 types of different Hashem Rechinam, Hashem Sachib. But let's say someone hires you the harshest type. They paid you to protect an animal, a cow that they had on their farm. So you're responsible to protect and make sure the animal doesn't get hurt. Now here's the question. What happens if the animal is walking, you're walking the animal, and the animal jumps into a fire? There's a fire on the side of the road and the animal jumps into it and gets killed or damaged. Are you the guardian, the guard, the hired guard responsible or not? The answer is very simple. A normal animal doesn't jump into fire. So you are responsible, unless you were told by the owner, this is a crazy animal who has a tendency to jump into fire. You didn't have any idea to know that, so you didn't watch out. You are responsible for natural or expected dangers. Animal falling into a pit, being hurt by another animal, the normal things. But how are you supposed to know that this animal is going to jump into fire? Why? Because animals, like all creatures, have a self-preservation button inside. They don't do things that are self-destructive. That's called a behemoth shaita, if it does. It means an insane animal, which this guard had no clue. So the Talmud is saying the following, a very profound concept. If you saw that by doing something that's inappropriate, it would be like putting your hand in fire. You saw the damage done by it. Would any normal person do that?
No.
Very good. How many years did it take you to learn that?
Had to grow up.
Yeah. So how is it possible that we can do things that are destructive to us physically or spiritually? The answer is we're blinded. It's shtus, like the animal. We're not in our normal state of being. In a normal state of being, we could not hurt each other, for example. Why? Because as the Arizal says, we're all part of one large organism. So Yerushalmi actually. Is it conceivable that the right hand would hit the left hand if it's misbehaving? No, because it's the same body. If you hit the left hand, it's like hitting the right hand. So how is it possible that human beings can hurt each other? And if you need proof for that, you're lucky. But it happens, unfortunately, more than... Because we don't feel ourselves. We feel ourselves as independent, autonomous entities, and one of us is not connected to the next. The same reason we can damage the environment, and the same reason we can hurt each other, and the same reason we can even hurt our own children. Because you're blind to the fact that we're all connected. Or you're blind to the fact that you're doing hurt. Maybe you convince yourself it's not hurt. So it's a form of shtus, it's a form of blindness, a form of insanity. That's not a plea of insanity that gets you off the hook. Because this insanity you have control over. So it's not that type of clinical insanity. That's what the Talmud is saying. And it's interesting, the word avera, in Hebrew, the word sin, is actually a very, very distorted translation of what the Torah really means by sin. It's usually that way in English. Actually, I would say sin is a completely Christian concept. The word avera, or sometimes you say chet, there's pesha, there's oven, there's many words, but the word avera used in this Talmudic statement, you know what, avera comes from a root. The root of the word avera is havara, which means to move something from one reshus to another, from one place to another place. Essentially, you could say avera, you can translate it as displacement. So if a mitzvah means, mitzvah comes from the word safsa v'chibur, connection, and avera is a disconnection. Think of a disconnection as opposed to a sin. Sin connotes and conjures up all kinds of negative imagery. Guilt, sin, I sinned against God. Disconnection is much more profound. It means you disconnected from your source, from your purpose, from yourself. You betrayed yourself. If a person saw that they were able to, that an act they did by hurting another person, or another avera, is a form of disconnection, which normal person would do that? So the only answer is because we don't see it. We're blinded. That we live in a state of darkness, basically. But we have the gift and the mind that we have, and we have the ability to see. But it takes effort. And this is ultimately the purpose of existence. So when we stand the 9 days, as I said earlier, it epitomizes this darkness, because of all the times in the year, this part of the year, this time of the year, is the so-called the darkest of all. The destruction of the temple was a perfect example. It wasn't because the temple was destroyed, that's why we cry. It's because something happened that caused the temple to be destroyed, that's why we cry. What happened? Why was it impossible for God to no longer be able to manifest in a physical structure on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem? Something must have happened. It wasn't just some anger. It was because the physical universe and the people who created this temple were no longer a keli, they were no longer a container for it. It says the second temple was destroyed because of sinas chinam, baseless hatred. So what? Well, you could say, who cares? So people hate each other. Why does God have to decide He has to leave His temple because people are disliking each other? Because Barchenu Avinu Kolanu Ke'echad, the blessings of God manifest when we are unified. The whole purpose of the temple is what? Is V'shachanti b'seichem. God says, I will rest among you. God's not interested in resting between stones and wood. It's not about resting in some museum piece. It's about a manifestation in the material universe that we, the dwelling, the place that we, the domain of this world, of this material world. If people essentially reject that divine presence through their behavior, where we had that baseless hatred, people could not see that they're all connected to one God, and not see that they're all part of one higher entity, it's a cause and effect. It automatically affected the destruction of the temple. So when we talk about reward and punishment, which is also somewhat of a misnomer, you find that Shalah writes that the reward and punishment, there are different opinions what it means, but ultimately the consensus, reward and punishment is not something what he calls guli, that you do something good and God gives you a candy for it. He says reward and punishment is sibum mesubov, cause and effect. Is fire punishing you when you put your hand in it? Or is that the cause and effect of this universe, the consequence of your behavior? Ultimately, reward and punishment in the Torah is not some type of God sitting on a throne in heaven. When you misbehave, He decides He's going to strike you with lightning. First of all, why would He care? Im tzedaktem atitun le, it says. Does our behavior, it's only God gets upset about our behavior? The answer is that God put into the system, we call it an immunity system. When infection enters into your body, and the antibodies come attack that infection, and because of that, there's swelling and there's pain. That's a blessing, not a curse. That's a consequence responding to an invasion. So when a person, for instance, as the Kabbalists put it, when you have anxiety, they'll say anxiety is the voice of the soul. The soul is saying, I'm not being fed. What happens when you're hungry? There's pains in your belly. What happens when your soul is hungry? You're going to have anxiety. And if you don't, it's much worse. It's like that story where the stroke victim, after months and months, he didn't feel anything, and one day the doctor
Tested him.
stuck a needle into him, and he started yelling, and the doctor was laughing. He says, "Why are you laughing? I'm in pain." He says, "Because for 4 months you didn't feel it." So feeling pain, even though we all take painkillers, or most of us do, or some of us do, we like. So I'm not talking about the simple pain that you want to get rid of, but a lot of painkillers, really, pain is the greatest warning there's something wrong. If we didn't feel pain, we would all be dead, basically. You wouldn't know that you're hurting yourself. You wouldn't know there's a nerve that's being pinched. These are warning signals. That doesn't mean pain is a good thing. It just means pain is giving you a forecast of what's coming. So the same is true spiritually. And in that context, when you say reward and punishment, it's not a temple was destroyed because one day the time came for a temple to be destroyed. It was a direct result of human behavior. Cause and effect. We write our destinies, basically, not written for us. That's why the Talmud also says that a generation that didn't rebuild the temple is as if they destroyed the temple. How could you say that? Why are we at fault for something that happened 1900 years ago? They did something wrong. Why is it? Because it's all about human behavior. If we don't correct it, it's as if we destroyed it. So it's all in our hands. Obviously, ultimately, it's a partnership, meaning that we have to do our part and then God has to choose to do His part. But as long as we don't initiate our side of the partnership, you can't do a lot of complaining. So nevertheless, you still see that tzaddikim and great people always pray to God that Mashiach should come already, and we shouldn't have to suffer any longer, and that we should no longer be in a world that is so displaced, we call the world of exile, because they said basically we already paid the price. Because we remember that we're not just independent creatures, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And a midget that stands on a nonos al gaba anok, a midget that stands on the shoulder of a giant, sees farther than the giant. Which means, by connecting to our roots, to those that came before us, so we have many, many schusovis, many, many merits. What happened, and Jewish philosophy explains, what happened to all the millions and millions of mitzvahs that were done for the last few thousand years? The prices and sacrifices paid by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, and the Jews in Egypt, and the 40 years in the wilderness, and the thousands of years that followed, and the suffering in the Middle Ages, whether it was the Crusades, or the pogroms, the Inquisition, and then the Holocaust. These are all part of our history, and we believe in a continuity. It's a chain. So we stand on shoulders of giants. The only thing that's asked of us is to connect to those shoulders. They tell the story about one of the Rebbes when he was in the camps, and he had a chassid with him. And there was in particular camp, there was a very cruel, extra cruel Nazi who would like to play a game with the Jews. And he had them dig these big trenches, which were of course meant for death, and in this case wide trenches. And his game was that him and his whole crew and his whole troop would stand there and point the guns, the rifles at the Jews, and say, jump over this trench. So whoever jumps over lives. Whoever falls in will be shot. Of course, most couldn't really make it. It wasn't a very narrow trench. So most were killed right there. But this Rebbe made it over to the other side, and his chassid as well. And they were actually finally redeemed. They were finally freed, liberated from the camps. So when the chassid and the Rebbe had a conversation about this, so the chassid said to the Rebbe, you're an older man. How did you make it across the trench? He said, well, I held on to the kapote. I held on to the garb of my father and grandfather and great-grandfather. There was always his faith, basically. He held on to that garb, and that helped him carry over. And the Rebbe said to the chassid, and what about you? How did you make it over? He says, I held on to your garb. So it's not about our greatness or weakness here. That after everything is said that I discussed earlier about our blind spots and so on, that we are part of a continuum. It's like a marathon where the baton is passed from generation to generation. But we come not just with a baton, we come with the miles and miles that were run and the prices paid by those that came before us. But on one condition, you have to connect to that. If you ignore that, then you are only a midget. You connected, then you have that power. It's like a tree with deep roots, bears powerful fruits. Disconnect from the roots, the tree doesn't have the nourishment that it needs to bear what it has to bear. So, these days that we are in now are paradoxical days. On one hand, we definitely have to look at ourselves. Maimonides writes, especially about fast days. He writes in the beginning of the laws of tinius, of fast days, referring to Tisha B'Av and Shavuos B'Tammuz, the different fast days through the year. He writes that when something befalls a community, a catastrophe, he calls it achzarius, it's cruel. If you could ignore it and say mikra nikris, it's like random, it's an accident. He says you have to take it to heart and personalize and see what can I do to improve my life, to better my ways. At the same time, this is not to be confused that it's a punishment necessarily. It doesn't say it's a punishment. It means you cannot ignore something happens. Something sad happens, it means, and you are aware of it, it means you have to do something about it. And you have the power to do something about it. At the same time, because we do come with generations before us, we also have many claims to make. We can demand certain things with humility, but we still can demand certain things because it's not just ourselves. We come with those that came before us. So to go back to on a personal note, the blind spots, the 9 days is like a big blind spot, I would say, historical one. It's due to the fact that the divine presence concealed itself on Tisha B'Av almost 2,000 years ago. Concealed itself. It's only concealed to our eyesight. So in a sense, it takes effort to find God. We do live in an agnostic universe. God concealed the presence and therefore made it very difficult for us to pierce that darkness. The 9 days epitomizes that. So in a way, our own personal blind spots are just microcosm of the big blind spot. And both of them are redeemed. Both of them are healed. The rift is healed through one way only. It's through being like a moon, humility. And the humility that leads you to be able to listen, to be able to find someone you could trust, no matter how disappointed you are, and to find someone that can give you a perspective that's a little different than your own. That is the secret to all growth. There's no way other than that. Now, of course, it's not just hearing that advice, it's also listening to it. But let's start one step at a time. And the same thing is when we talk about God. This so-called cosmic concealment, what the Rizal calls, whose yahrzeit was yesterday, calls the Tzimtzum Arishin. The Seidat Tzimtzum he calls the secret of the Tzimtzum. The secret of the divine concealment that really allows existence to be. The fact that there's so much pain in this world, the fact that we even have blind spots, all come from one big blind spot, which is that God himself concealed is the first one that is really has created a masquerade, and to the extent that it's so almost airtight that it's for all of us very conceivable that we can deny God's presence in our lives. Even the people of the greatest faith do not feel 24/7 that God is with them, or else they would not be capable of doing anything that is so-called antithetical to God. So all of us have ruach shtus, more than one. And there's the expression in the Talmud, Gamva apum achtarti rachmone karye. Anybody knows what that means? I know there's some scholars here. A thief, before he goes out to steal, he prays to God that he should succeed. Now, that's a ruach shtus. Why? How is it possible? How could somebody knows there's a God, he's going to pray to God. The God said in the 10 Commandments, Lo signev, do not steal. So he's going to pray to God that told him not to steal, to help me do what you told me not to do. It's one thing to say, hey, at this moment, I don't know there's a God, I do what I want. That would make sense. But he's going to God, how does that work exactly? It's much easier to understand, as I said, someone just denies God or is just not thinking about it and gives into his temptations, to his desires, greed, whatever it is, need for money.
That's how he makes his living.
Yeah, I'll tell you something about that in a minute. So the answer is, because faith is very, very complex. Faith is paradoxical. The way the Hasidic masters put it, faith is makif. You can have a lot of faith, and true faith. I'm not talking about a faker, con artist. But faith on its own is makif. It surrounds you. It's not primistic. It's not internalized, and you didn't own it. You can have faith and not own faith. And if you don't own faith, if it's not nourished and personalized, ultimately you're able to do things that are contradictory to your own faith, because the faith that hovers above you. And that's also a form of a blind spot. So our challenge is, no matter where you are, whether you're a person that considers yourself a person of faith, or you're a person that doesn't have faith or does not know, all of us are in the same boat. It's just a matter of extent and how it manifests. And all of us are biased, and all of us have blind spots. But the consolation is that it is God himself who created the biggest blind spot. He concealed his presence. As the Levitzer Barditchev would like to say, he says, no, a big kunz, which means a big trick you showed, he says to God. You gave us a difficult life, a cruel life. with a very powerful evil inclination, temptations all around us. And you wrote in the holy books that there's a spiritual world and there's an Elam Haba and there's beautiful paradise, Gan Eden, to look forward to. He says, why don't you try to reverse things for a moment? Give us, in reality, let us live a life in paradise, in the spirit, the world of spirit, and give us books where you write about the cruelty and the corruption and the greed and the selfishness of this world. Which is the fact. We live in a world where we're told these things, and it takes effort to hold on to. No matter how spiritual you are, you still relate to the tangible more than to the sublime. That's how it is. The most spiritual human being wakes up every morning, you see the physical world, you do not see the spiritual. You feel hungry when you're physically hungry. Spiritual hunger is not quite the same. You can go years and not feed your soul. You can't go days without feeding your body. But we know this, and when you know this, that itself is half the cure. Yediyas hamachla is chetzi refuah. And it helps understand that there is serious blind spots, and our job is to find someone that can see. For us, it may just be someone that sees it differently than you do. They don't have to be necessarily more sublime than you, but you're subjective in your area. You help me, I help you type of thing. We all can help each other look at certain things. The challenge, I would say, the hardest challenge is not necessarily our own humility. I think it's also finding someone you can trust. But as we're told, we're not asked to do anything that we don't have the power to do. Since we do have blind spots, and since we have plenty of traps, we believe as well that God gave us enough tools to counter that. That means there's someone there that we could find, that we can trust. And you have to look a little more and not give up. And remember to keep your standards high. Just because there are disappointments in the past, it doesn't mean you have to lower your bar. It's not an easy thing to do, to keep it high, because it requires a lot of effort. But that's why I feel, and this is why I want to thank everyone here, and through the years that I've been giving this class, I get a lot of strength from people in their journey, because I feel I'm on a journey, and when we feel we're in the journey together, it makes it easier. So even though I'm doing the speaking and you're doing the listening, technically speaking, you may be speaking more than I am, and I may be listening more than you are. And in a way, we feed each other, and it doesn't stop in this room, of course. The journey continues, everyone back in their own existential lonely place. But if we know that we are part of a journey together, and we're part of something that's bigger than the small you and the small me, it definitely gives a lot of strength. So though 9 days is not necessarily a time you'd say, wow, it's a time, the most celebratory time, but in a strange way, it does say Tisha B'Av will be the greatest holiday. Because as I said earlier in the beginning tonight, that which doesn't kill me makes me stronger. And Tisha B'Av, because it didn't kill the people, it was kilach chamosei al eitz al pos and al eitzim ba'avonim, and we are here today in a way as a testimony that we are stronger than the pain and the losses of Tisha B'Av, because we're still here to talk about it. And we believe firmly that the journey will come to a conclusion, and a conclusion not apocalyptic one, a peaceful one, and this world will be transformed into a world of higher spiritual consciousness. But to use the words of the Yeshaya, a mola oretz deis Hashem kamayim layam mechasim, a world filled with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea. I said to some people that may sound better when you say a state of heightened consciousness and awareness, but it's the same idea. And so I thank you all for that. I want to share some good news. At least I think it's good news. After quite a few years searching for a space, I don't mean space like an outer space, I mean a physical space to do a lot more programming and activities. I could say myself, in the Meaningful Life Center, our organization has found the space. It's an East Village, which I hear is the roots of a lot of psychedelic consciousness as well. But that's not what we plan to bring there. And I will say, this has been a request from many of you, so I'd like to share this as well. So for the first time, though I've done it in other states and other countries, I will be leading a Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur service at this place. And if you want more details, information, I'm telling you, you're the first to hear it, because it's just determined literally last day or two. So you could either just approach either Velvel or myself. We'll soon send out an email with more details. And obviously I'd be honored to do it together with all of you. I don't see it as a give and take. I see it more like a collaborative, interactive Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur experience. To me it was always very painful, and this is the reason I wrote 60 Days. The book that some of you may be familiar with, that is a workbook that begins from the throes and pains of Tisha B'Av. We go into the love and beauty of Elul and Tishrei. So I just want to share with you one brief story. It happened in this class, actually. I was invited by a friend of mine, Peter Himmelman, who's a musician and the son-in-law of Bob Dylan, for some who need to know that. He lives in Santa Monica, California. So he invited me to do Rosh Hashanah, a Yom Kippur service in California. And he promoted, and they rented out a theater, some old place, and it was promoted for the unaffiliated. And I had no idea how many people will show up. So this Yom Kippur, 1,500 people came.
Wow.
I guess it was due to my name, his name, but there was also, most of the people were secular. It was a mix. And I did a very hands-on, it was a complete Yom Kippur service. We had a chazan that did the whole service, which is, so in case anybody wants to go through, Santa Monica, California. We're now in New York. Now we're doing it in New York. But something very profound happened to me there, so first of all, obviously I did it very hands-on. I explained everything because I know for myself, though I'm fluent in Hebrew and I've davened my whole life, frankly, if you go through the Machzor, the high holiday prayers, the greatest scholar, it's almost impossible to understand most of those prayers. Let's be very honest. We say them, God understands it, comes from our heart, and the Chazan hopefully understands it. Not Afghan either, but but so I felt that a great way to do this is to really decipher at least the process, and it's a very unbelievable personal experience when you really understand the soul behind all these prayers. So I remember a woman came over to me afterwards who was never Yom Kippur service before. She said to me, she was very moved, and also I did a discussion group in the middle of the day when they could take a break. Did a little discussion, and she said to me, she lives in New York, and she'd like to know where she can go to Yom Kippur service. Now she considered herself a Zen Buddhist. She's Jewish, but Zen Buddhism was her thing. So I suggested to her a shul. I'm not going to mention names, and it was a fine experience. But she said to me the next year, she started coming to this class, and she said to me, I went to Yom Kippur to a service, but frankly, it wasn't as spiritual. It wasn't really as personal as I could relate to. So I'd like to stay home, and I'm going to be reading some of my Zen Buddhist meditations on Yom Kippur. And she was not being cynical or malicious. She really was sincere. And I was like so in a way pained by it. I understood where she's coming from. So I said to her, I would like to, if you'd like, you come to my office a few times before Rosh Hashanah, before Yom Kippur, and I'd like to learn with you some of the prayers. And it forced me. I felt like a certain competitive side to beat the Zen Buddhism. This is a good competition, and their stuff is quite good. So I said to myself, so I dug deeper, and I went into the Machzor, into the prayer book, and I sat with her, and I taught her that some of these prayers, and I have to say to our credit together, she actually today is a completely observant person just because of that. Because she learned that when you dig deeper, you could find within these prayers. And that really was the genesis of why I wrote 60 Days. Because I realized there are many, many Jews, and who knows how many, that want to inspire, they're hungry, especially Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and want to find a true meaningful experience. And there are many good synagogues, don't get me wrong. But some speak to some don't speak to others, especially if you don't know the Hebrew. And it's a challenge. And there's so many that don't even go into a synagogue. So, as I said, I'd like to announce that this year I will do it, and for yourselves or anyone you think is appropriate, it will be a complete legitimate service in the regular sense, if you like that part, but most importantly, it will be to bring it alive for myself, for all of everybody that I could bring it alive to, and it will have a lot of interactive elements. So if you want, as I said, more details, you'll hear about them, and you can ask Velvel or myself, and we'll be happy to so-called sign you up if you like. We're beginning as we speak to do that. So, with that being said, they have to daven Ma'ariv here in a few minutes. I want to also announce that this class is dedicated by our good friend Mark, and Polinsky in honor of his grandfather's yahrzeit Menachem Mendel ben Meir, 4th of Av, and in honor of the yahrzeit of the Arizal, 5th of Av. Okay, a good equation. And well, meanwhile we are still here, and you'll hear more news. Stay tuned for more news to come. And if you write down, if you haven't given me your email, I'll be happy to. If you write down your emails, especially with this latest information, we'll be happy to send you any updates, and they will be coming in the next short while. And thank you again for traveling together.
Thank you.
Everyone have a good night. Thank you very much.